Imagine a prison older than most Canadian cities, a place where stone walls have witnessed nearly 150 years of riots, violence, survival, and transformation. This is Stony Mountain Institution, one of Canada's oldest federal prisons, and for many inmates during its darkest years, the worst prison Canada can offer. Stony Mountain Institution's roots stretch back to 1877, a time when Canada itself was still shaping its identity and expanding westward into what would later become Manitoba. The decision to build a federal prison in this region was influenced by a mixture of political, social, and geographic factors. The Canadian government recognized the need for a long-term correctional facility that could serve the growing prairie population and support the federal justice system as the country expanded beyond the central provinces. Manitoba had joined Confederation only 7 years earlier, in 1870, and government officials saw the construction of a penitentiary as a symbolic and functional step toward establishing law, order, and federal presence on the western frontier. When Stony Mountain Institution was built, prison design followed 19th-century philosophies that were rigid, strict, and heavily influenced by British penal traditions. Early penitentiaries were not primarily about rehabilitation. They were about discipline, order, and control. Structures were constructed with thick stone walls, narrow windows, and small cells meant to isolate inmates and enforce silence. Stony Mountain embraced this model, and its earliest buildings reflected the harsh, utilitarian approach of the era. The institution was deliberately built in a rural area north of Winnipeg, both to keep inmates isolated from the public and to ensure escapes would be difficult. The surrounding landscape, open prairie, harsh winters, and limited nearby settlements, acted as a natural barrier against escape attempts. In the late 1800s, the early years of operations were defined by strict routines. Inmates were expected to follow rigid daily schedules, engage in physically demanding labor, and live under constant surveillance. Much of their work involved agriculture, construction, and maintaining the institution's grounds, since the prison was largely self-sustaining during its early decades. There was limited access to education or personal development opportunities, as the primary goal of incarceration at the time was punishment rather than rehabilitation. The moral mindset of the era emphasized discipline, and the belief was that hard work and strict confinement would deter future criminal behavior. Living conditions in these early decades were extremely difficult by modern standards. Cells were small, dark, and sparsely furnished. Heating was inconsistent, especially during Manitoba's brutally cold winters, and sanitation facilities were limited. Overcrowding quickly became an issue as the region's population grew and the justice system evolved. Inmates would sometimes be housed two to a cell not designed for more than one person, creating tensions and adding to the pressure within the prison walls. Medical care was basic and often inadequate, and outbreaks of illness were common in the early years due to poor ventilation and a lack of modern hygiene practices. The staff responsible for overseeing the institution also faced significant challenges. Guards in the late 19th and early 20th centuries operated under extremely demanding conditions. They were required to enforce strict rules with limited support or training, and they worked long hours in a harsh environment. The early prison administration focused heavily on order and military-style discipline, and relationships between inmates and staff were formal, distant, and often tense. Despite these pressures, Stony Mountain developed a reputation for being a symbol of federal authority in Western Canada, an institution intended to maintain order in a rapidly developing region. As the prison entered the early 20th century, its historical foundation continued to shape its identity. The facility expanded its infrastructure over the decades, with new wings, workshops, and service buildings constructed to accommodate the changing needs of the era. Yet many of the original architectural elements remained standing, serving as constant reminders of the institution's long history. The stone buildings, heavy iron doors, and fortress-like layout reflected the philosophy of the era in which they were created. For many decades, these features contributed to the institution's reputation as a tough, unforgiving place, one where discipline overshadowed rehabilitation. Stony Mountain also played a role in the evolution of Canada's correctional philosophy. As national attitudes toward criminal justice began to shift in the mid-20th century, the institution slowly introduced new programs, educational opportunities, and vocational training. But even with these gradual changes, the legacy of its early foundation remained deeply rooted in its culture. Inmates who arrived during the mid-century often lived in buildings that had been constructed decades earlier, and the prison's atmosphere was shaped by the traditions of its origins. Throughout its history, Stony Mountain's remote location continued to define its identity. It was intentionally placed far from major city centers, creating a sense of physical and psychological distance from society. The isolation was originally seen as beneficial, making the prison easier to control and harder to escape, but it also contributed to the feeling of toughness and severity that surrounded the institution. Visitors, staff, and inmates alike often described the facility as imposing, its old stone structures standing as mute witnesses to generations of struggle, violence, and human stories. The prison's long existence means that countless events, changes, and eras have passed through its gates. From the early settlement years to modern Canada, Stony Mountain Institution has continuously operated as a federal correctional facility, adapting to shifting national values while never fully escaping the weight of its origins. Its foundation in 1877 created not just a physical structure but a lasting legacy, one that continues to influence how the institution is perceived, managed, and understood today, more than a century after those first stone walls were erected. When Stony Mountain Institution first opened in 1877, it operated as a single-purpose penitentiary with a uniform level of custody. There was no concept of multiple security classifications as we understand them today. The prison was designed as a straightforward confinement facility where inmates were held in a traditional, highly controlled environment. Over time, however, Canada's correctional philosophy evolved dramatically, pushing institutions like Stony Mountain to adapt. This transformation, from a simple 19th-century stone prison into a modern complex housing inmates across minimum, medium, and maximum security, became one of the defining developments in its long history. In the early decades, all offenders entering Stony Mountain were placed under essentially the same security conditions regardless of their offense, behavior, or risk level. This approach reflected the penal logic of the era, which emphasized strict discipline over rehabilitation. The idea of categorizing inmates based on risk assessment, psychological evaluation, or reintegration prospects had not yet developed. The prison functioned as a uniform entity, one in which every inmate lived under the same rigid routines, the same surveillance, and the same architectural constraints. As Canada grew and the justice system matured, it became clear that this one-size-fits-all model was neither efficient nor effective. By the mid-20th century, federal correctional policy began shifting toward individualized management and rehabilitation. Criminologists and policymakers recognized that not all inmates posed the same level of risk, and that mixing low-risk offenders with high-risk, violent inmates often had negative outcomes. This change in philosophy laid the foundation for Stony Mountain's gradual evolution into a multi-security institution. Instead of relying on a single model of confinement, federal prisons began separating inmates based on comprehensive assessments that considered behavior, psychological profiles, escape risk, and long-term correctional needs. Stony Mountain responded to this shift by expanding its physical structure and operational capacity. New buildings were added, new wings were constructed, and separate areas were designated for different categories of inmates. Over time, the institution adopted a layered security design, separating inmates not only by their risk levels, but also by their program needs, cultural supports, and reintegration planning. The introduction of these separate zones fundamentally changed how the institution functioned. It became a more complex environment in which different parts of the facility operated with distinct rules, staffing patterns, and levels of freedom for the inmates. One of the most significant milestones in this evolution was the construction of the Maximum Security Unit. This unit represented a major shift in both infrastructure and philosophy. Unlike the older sections of the institution, which reflected 19th-century design principles, the Maximum Security Unit was built with modern correctional standards in mind. Reinforced barriers, advanced surveillance systems, controlled movement pathways, and state-of-the-art security technologies. Its purpose was to house inmates who posed serious risks. Individuals involved in violent offenses, gang-related activity, escape attempts, or incidents that required a higher level of containment. This new wing allowed Stony Mountain to separate its most dangerous inmates from the general population, reducing risks and improving safety for both staff and inmates. At the same time, the prison also expanded programs and facilities designed for lower-risk offenders. Minimum security areas offered more open environments, less restrictive movement, and greater access to vocational training, work programs, and reintegration services. These zones were critical in preparing inmates for gradual release into the community, a cornerstone of modern Canadian correctional philosophy. The contrast between these units and the high-security areas was striking. While one focused on structure and containment, the other emphasized responsibility, skill building, and reintegration. Medium security, the largest segment of the institution, developed its own distinct identity. It housed inmates who required supervision but did not need the extreme restrictions of maximum security. The routines in these units balanced control with opportunity, allowing for structured programs, education, and work while maintaining stricter movement and supervision than in minimum security. This middle layer became one of the most important aspects of Stony Mountain's operational model because it served the majority of inmates and acted as a bridge between the extremes. The evolution into a multi-security facility also required significant changes in staffing and operational protocols. Correctional officers were trained differently depending on the unit in which they worked. Maximum security environments demanded high alertness, tactical readiness, and strict procedural compliance. Medium security officers focused more on routine management, conflict resolution, and inmate interaction. Minimum security staff often played a role similar to instructors or supervisors, overseeing work programs and helping guide inmates through reintegration pathways. This diversification of roles reshaped the culture of the institution, creating a more layered and specialized workforce. Stony Mountain's shift into a multi-security complex reflected broader national trends, but it also responded to specific challenges within the institution. The prison had experienced periods of violence, gang tensions, and overcrowding. Separating inmates by security level helped reduce these pressures and allowed administrators to manage conflicts more effectively. Moreover, specialized facilities enabled Stony Mountain to meet the needs of Indigenous inmates through cultural programming, spiritual support, and elder services located within designated units. These programs grew increasingly important as the institution adapted to the needs of the diverse population it served. The transformation was not only structural but also philosophical. What began as a uniform, punishment-focused institution gradually evolved into a complex correctional environment that balanced safety, control, and rehabilitation. This multi-security model became a defining characteristic of Stony Mountain and remains central to its operations today, reflecting more than a century of change in Canadian correctional practice. During its early decades, Stony Mountain Institution was known for living conditions that would be considered extremely harsh by modern standards. These conditions were not unusual for 19th-century prisons, but at Stony Mountain, located in the unforgiving climate of the Canadian prairies, the challenges were intensified. The physical environment, the primitive infrastructure, and the penal philosophies of the time all contributed to an atmosphere that was austere, demanding, and often punishing for both inmates and staff. The prison's earliest buildings were constructed with thick stone walls and minimal insulation. This design reflected the architectural norms of the late 1800s, prioritizing durability and containment over comfort or livability. Inmates were housed in narrow, sparsely furnished cells that measured only a few feet wide. Each cell typically contained a simple cot, a blanket, and a metal pail for sanitation, nothing more. Ventilation was poor, leaving inmates to endure stagnant air in the summer and penetrating cold drafts in the winter. Manitoba's winters are famously severe, with temperatures plunging far below freezing, and during those early decades the heating systems were rudimentary at best. Many inmates described shivering through the night in damp blankets, with frost sometimes forming on the inside of the cell walls. Sanitation posed another major challenge. In the 19th century there were no modern plumbing systems inside the prison. Waste buckets, known as slop pails, were used in each cell and emptied at designated times. The smell of these pails, combined with the overcrowding that eventually developed, created an environment that was not only unpleasant but also hazardous to health. Diseases spread easily, especially during the winter months when ventilation was further restricted to conserve heat. Inmates faced frequent outbreaks of illness, ranging from influenza to tuberculosis, and medical care was minimal. A small infirmary existed, but resources were limited and often insufficient to meet the needs of the population. Many inmates relied on basic remedies and isolation rather than comprehensive treatment. Food quality and availability were also major concerns during the institution's early years. Meals were simple, repetitive, and often lacked nutritional balance. Diets typically included bread, porridge, salted meat, and occasionally vegetables grown on the prison grounds. Because the prison was partially self-sustaining, inmates contributed to farming and livestock work, yet this did not guarantee adequate nutrition. Food shortages occurred during difficult winters or when crops failed, and rationing was common. Meal preparation facilities were basic, and food was sometimes served cold, adding to the discomfort of daily life. Discipline within the institution was strict and unforgiving. The penal philosophy of the era centered on punishment, control, and the belief that hardship led to moral reform. As a result, Inmates were subjected to rigid daily schedules that allowed little room for individuality or rest. Silence was enforced for long periods, especially during meals and work hours. Communication between inmates was restricted, and disobedience could result in severe consequences. Common disciplinary measures included solitary confinement in dark, cramped cells, reduced rations, shackling, or being assigned to the most physically demanding labor tasks. Solitary confinement, in particular, was used frequently and often for extended periods, despite its psychological toll. Labor formed a central part of inmate life. Prisoners were expected to perform physically strenuous work, often outdoors regardless of the weather. Tasks included quarrying stone, constructing new buildings, farming the surrounding land, repairing infrastructure, and maintaining the prison's livestock. This labor was considered essential not only for discipline but also for keeping the institution operational. However, the workload could be grueling and injuries were common. Tools were basic, protective gear was non-existent, and oversight sometimes prioritized productivity over safety. When accidents occurred, medical treatment was limited, leaving many inmates with long-term injuries or disabilities. Overcrowding emerged as another challenge by the early 20th century as Manitoba's population grew and crime rates shifted. Stony Mountain was forced to house more inmates than originally intended. Cells designed for one person occasionally held two, exacerbating tensions and creating additional strain on already fragile infrastructure. Overcrowding made sanitation issues worse, increased the spread of disease, and heightened the potential for conflict among inmates. Guards, too, felt the effects of overcrowding, facing increased workloads and greater safety risks within the confined environment. The harsh conditions extended beyond the inmates to the staff who worked within the institution. Early correctional officers operated under demanding circumstances with limited training and support. Their duties involved enforcing strict rules, supervising labor, managing sanitation routines, and responding to frequent conflicts or disciplinary issues. The lack of staffing and the severity of conditions often placed officers in physically dangerous situations. The prison's remote location added another layer of difficulty. Staff lived far from urban centers, faced extreme weather during their commutes, and had few resources for addressing the mental or emotional demands of their work. Social isolation was a defining feature of life inside Stony Mountain. The prison's remote location, combined with the strict rules limiting communication, meant inmates had little contact with the outside world. Letters were censored, visits were rare, and news from beyond the stone walls arrived slowly. The psychological effects of long-term isolation were significant, especially when combined with the harsh physical environment. For many inmates, the experience was not just one of confinement but one of profound loneliness and emotional deprivation. These early conditions shaped the institution's reputation, laying the groundwork for decades of commentary from inmates, staff, officials, and historians. Stony Mountain became associated with toughness, endurance, and survival in a place where both climate and philosophy converged to create an environment of relentless hardship. Even as reforms arrived in later decades, the memory of these harsh beginnings continued to influence how the institution was perceived and understood. Throughout its long history, Stony Mountain Institution has experienced numerous episodes of unrest that have shaped both its internal culture and its public reputation. These disturbances did not emerge spontaneously. They were usually the result of a combination of long-standing tensions, harsh conditions, overcrowding, and evolving inmate dynamics. Riots, protests, lockdowns, and violent clashes became defining moments that revealed deeper systemic challenges within the institution. Each incident left an imprint, contributing to an ongoing narrative of volatility and highlighting the constant struggle to maintain order within a complex correctional environment. In the early decades of operation, unrest took the form of smaller disturbances rather than full-scale riots. Tensions simmered beneath the strict routines imposed by the 19th century penal system. Harsh conditions, limited communication, and heavy workloads created an atmosphere where frustration could escalate quickly. Because discipline was rigid and consequences severe, even minor acts of resistance, refusing labor, speaking out of turn, or violating the silence rule, were treated as significant threats. These early uprisings rarely grew large, but they demonstrated how fragile stability could be in a facility where hundreds of men lived under extreme pressure. By the mid-20th century, the nature of unrest began to change. The inmate population grew more diverse, and the prison environment became more crowded. Incidents of collective resistance increased, often triggered by poor living conditions, complaints about food quality, or a lack of recreational or educational opportunities. As rehabilitative philosophies emerged, inmates became more vocal about their rights and expectations. When these demands were not met, protests and work stoppages sometimes escalated into confrontations. Guards faced increasing difficulty managing large groups of inmates who felt they had little to lose. One of the central drivers of unrest at Stony Mountain has consistently been overcrowding. When too many inmates are housed in limited space, tensions naturally rise. Shared cells, limited access to showers, overburdened medical services, and strained programming contribute to anger and frustration. Overcrowding also makes it harder for staff to maintain control, as the ratio of officers to inmates becomes increasingly unbalanced. This imbalance has historically provided fertile ground for riots to grow quickly and unexpectedly. In such conditions, a dispute that might otherwise be contained, an argument in the dining hall or a conflict in the yard, could spread rapidly, drawing others into the chaos. Gang activity became another major factor in later decades. As gangs gained influence within the Canadian prison system, their presence inside Stony Mountain intensified the potential for violent confrontations. Rivalries that began on the street often continued, or escalated, behind bars. Gang-affiliated inmates formed alliances, controlled illicit trade, and sometimes used violence to assert dominance. This added an organized, strategic element to unrest that had previously been more spontaneous. A conflict between rival groups could ignite a larger riot, pulling uninvolved inmates into the aggression as tensions erupted across entire units. Some of the most serious incidents involved coordinated actions by inmates who felt mistreated or ignored by the administration. Hunger strikes, barricaded cells, and refusal to return to living units were methods used to force negotiations. In some cases, inmates attempted to take control of areas within the prison, leading to extended lockdowns. These tactical forms of resistance were driven by grievances such as perceived unfair disciplinary practices, denial of privileges, lack of access to programs, or claims of excessive force by staff. When the administration attempted to restore order, clashes often broke out, resulting in injuries to both inmates and officers. Riots also frequently broke out during periods of transition, when new policies were introduced, when units were renovated, or when inmates were moved between security levels. Change disrupted routines and increased uncertainty, making the institution more vulnerable to unrest. For example, when the maximum security unit was introduced, it initially caused tension as high-risk inmates were relocated and the classification system became more rigid. Some resisted these changes, leading to conflicts that required significant intervention. Staffing challenges often contributed to the escalation of unrest. Understaffed units placed enormous pressure on correctional officers, who were expected to manage increasingly complex inmate dynamics with limited support. Fatigue, miscommunication, and inconsistent enforcement of rules sometimes created openings for confrontations to escalate. During a riot, staff had to rely on tactical teams, specialized equipment, and coordinated response strategies to regain control. The aftermath of these events often involved days or weeks of lockdowns, during which the institution worked to repair damage, investigate causes, and restore a sense of order. Violence during riots was not limited to inmate-against-inmate conflict. Throughout its history, Stony Mountain has seen incidents where staff were threatened, injured, or taken hostage during major disturbances. These events triggered large-scale emergency responses and brought national attention to the prison. Hostage situations were particularly dangerous because they placed employees directly in harm's way and escalated tensions across the entire facility. Such incidents often led to external investigations, media coverage, and calls for reform. The physical toll of riots could be substantial. Damage to cells, furniture, security barriers, and internal infrastructure was common. Fires were sometimes set, filling units with smoke and forcing evacuations. Inmates used improvised weapons, overturned tables, broke windows, and barricaded doors. Each destructive episode required extensive repairs and increased the strain on resources. The financial cost of riot damage added to the administrative burden, further complicating efforts to maintain the institution over the long term. These prolonged periods of unrest became part of Stony Mountain's identity, reinforcing its reputation as a prison where tensions regularly reached boiling point. Even as efforts were made to modernize the facility and improve conditions, the legacy of past riots shaped perceptions of the institution, both inside and outside its walls. Violence has long been a defining feature of life inside Stony Mountain Institution, shaping its reputation, influencing its operational policies, and affecting every individual who lives or works within its walls. From the earliest decades of operation, when harsh conditions and rigid discipline created a volatile environment, to more modern eras marked by gang conflicts and organized resistance, violence has repeatedly surfaced as both a symptom and a cause of deeper structural challenges. Among the most serious episodes have been the hostage situations, moments when tensions escalated so drastically that inmates seized correctional officers or other staff members, holding them as leverage to demand change or force negotiations. These incidents left profound psychological impacts and became pivotal points in the history of the institution. The roots of violence inside Stony Mountain lie in the prison's early design and operational philosophy. The strict, punitive model of the late 19th and early 20th centuries emphasized control over communication and discipline over rehabilitation. Inmates were expected to obey without question, endure long periods of silence, and accept physically demanding labor. When grievances arose, whether related to food, living conditions, or perceived mistreatment, there were few legitimate channels for inmates to express frustration. Instead, tensions often manifested as physical altercations, assaults on fellow inmates, or conflicts with staff. Although these early incidents were usually spontaneous and contained, they established a pattern that would repeat in more severe forms as the population grew and diversified. By the mid-20th century, violence had become a more organized and sometimes predictable part of the institutional environment. Overcrowding, limited resources, and the increasing presence of inmates serving longer sentences contributed to a heightened sense of desperation. Fights became more frequent in shared areas such as the dining hall, recreation yard, showers, and work sites. Correctional officers were trained to intervene quickly, but the ratio of officers to inmates often left them vulnerable. A single dispute could escalate in seconds, drawing in multiple participants and overwhelming staff before reinforcements could arrive. One of the most significant shifts occurred when gangs began to form a strong presence within the institution. These groups brought street rivalries into the prison and introduced a more coordinated, strategic form of violence. Gang-affiliated inmates operated with a clear hierarchy, and their conflicts were no longer isolated personal disputes. They were turf wars transferred behind the walls. These rivalries heightened the risk for everyone inside, including inmates who were not affiliated with any group. The mere presence of rival factions in close proximity often created an atmosphere of constant tension, with violent outbreaks sometimes triggered by minor provocations or long-standing grudges. Weapons played a significant role in escalating these confrontations. While Stony Mountain, like all federal institutions, implemented strict rules to prevent weapons from entering the facility, inmates often improvised tools using metal scraps, sharpened objects, or everyday items turned into dangerous instruments. The availability of such makeshift weapons turned fights into potentially lethal encounters. Correctional staff had to adapt by increasing searches, monitoring suspicious movements, and developing strategies to intercept weapons before they were used. Still, despite these efforts, violent incidents continued to occur and sometimes resulted in severe injuries or fatalities. Hostage situations represented the most extreme form of violence within Stony Mountain. These incidents were typically driven by desperation, deteriorating conditions, or collective frustration that had reached a breaking point. In some cases, inmates took hostages to protest perceived injustices, such as unfair punishments, lack of access to medical care, or reductions in privileges. In others, the incidents arose from power struggles, escape attempts, or conflicts that escalated beyond their original intent. Hostage takers sometimes used correctional officers as bargaining chips to force negotiations with the administration, hoping to leverage their demands in exchange for the return of staff. These situations created immediate crises that required careful, strategic responses. Once a hostage was taken, the institution entered an emergency protocol. Tactical teams, negotiators, and senior administrators were deployed to regain control while ensuring the safety of the hostage. In many cases, negotiators attempted to de-escalate the situation by building communication with the inmates, offering assurances, or making temporary concessions to prevent harm. Meanwhile, tactical units positioned themselves to intervene if negotiations failed or if the hostage's life was in imminent danger. For the hostages, often correctional officers performing routine duties, the experience was terrifying and deeply traumatic. Many later described feelings of helplessness, not knowing whether they would survive or be harmed as tensions escalated. These incidents also had a profound impact on the officer community. After a hostage event, staff often reported increased stress, anxiety, and distrust, particularly if they felt unsupported or if policy failures contributed to the situation. The aftermath of a hostage crisis typically involved internal reviews, policy changes, and recommendations for improved security measures. Sometimes this included adding surveillance cameras, increasing staffing levels, improving training, or redesigning units to reduce blind spots where attacks could occur. Inmate-on-inmate violence also continued to shape daily life within the institution. Assaults happened in a range of settings, from spontaneous fistfights in common areas to premeditated attacks planned by groups seeking dominance. Some incidents were related to debts, contraband disputes, or personal conflicts, while others reflected broader power struggles. These violent episodes not only endangered those involved but also contributed to an atmosphere of fear and instability. Inmates who had no desire to engage in conflict often found themselves navigating a dangerous environment where alliances and rivalries influenced every aspect of survival. Throughout its history, Stony Mountain's administrative response to violence evolved. Policies were adjusted, units were reorganized, and new technologies were introduced to track inmates more effectively. Yet violence remained an ongoing challenge, a reflection of deeper systemic issues such as overcrowding, mental health struggles, entrenched gang culture, and the inherent pressures of incarceration. Each violent incident, especially the hostage situations, served as a reminder of the delicate balance required to maintain safety in a place where tension can erupt at any moment. The introduction of the maximum security unit at Stony Mountain Institution marked a significant turning point in the facility's history, reshaping both its physical structure and its internal culture. When the expansion was completed and activated, it was not merely the addition of new cell blocks. It represented a shift in correctional philosophy. Stony Mountain, once primarily known as a medium-security institution with long-standing historical foundations, now had to balance the practical demands of housing higher-risk individuals with the legacy of an antiquated infrastructure. This change brought with it a new era, one defined by heightened security protocols, evolving inmate demographics, and intensified operational pressure on staff. The decision to add a maximum security component was driven by several factors. National crime trends, sentencing patterns, and regional needs contributed to an increase in the number of inmates classified as high risk. Manitoba required a facility capable of handling offenders who posed threats not only through violent behavior but through organizational influence, escape attempts, or chronic misconduct. Previously, many of Manitoba's most dangerous offenders were transferred out of province, creating logistical challenges and separation issues. The maximum security wing at Stony Mountain provided a local environment designed to meet the needs of the prairie region while reducing reliance on more distant institutions. The architecture of the new unit was fundamentally different from the older sections of the prison, which had been constructed in the late 19th century and expanded gradually over the following decades. The maximum security design incorporated contemporary correctional standards, emphasizing control, visibility, and containment. Cells were reinforced, surveillance coverage was expanded, and movement pathways were deliberately structured to minimize cross-traffic. Common areas were designed with reduced blind spots, and staff stations were built with additional protections. These features were intended to reduce opportunities for violence, escape, or manipulation, and to ensure that staff could monitor inmate behavior more efficiently. Yet despite these technological improvements, the introduction of a maximum security population intensified the already challenging environment at Stony Mountain. Higher-risk inmates brought with them complex behavioral profiles, often involving histories of violent crime, gang leadership, or deep-seated institutional resistance. Correctional officers were now required to manage individuals who might respond to routine interactions with aggression, defiance, or calculated manipulation. This placed a heavy emphasis on specialized training, particularly in crisis intervention, defensive tactics, and negotiation skills. Staff had to understand not only physical safety protocols but also the psychological dynamics of dealing with inmates who had a greater propensity for disruptive or dangerous behavior. The maximum security unit also changed the culture of the prison itself. With the introduction of inmates who were accustomed to high levels of control and restriction, tensions between populations grew more pronounced. Some inmates who had previously been housed in medium security settings viewed the new unit as a symbol of increased rigidity, fearing that practices from the maximum security side would spill over into their daily routines. Others saw the separation as necessary, understanding that combining lower-risk and higher-risk individuals had previously contributed to violence and instability. Regardless of perspective, the expansion created a more stratified inmate population, with clearer divisions based on behavior and risk level. Interactions between maximum security inmates and staff carried unique challenges. Communication was often more guarded, and daily routines were heavily structured. Tasks that might be simple in lower security environments, escorting inmates to the yard, distributing meals, conducting cell searches, became more complex when dealing with individuals who might exploit any moment of vulnerability. For officers, the psychological burden increased as well. The constant need for situational awareness, combined with the ever-present potential for confrontation, contributed to higher levels of stress and burnout. In some cases, officers assigned to the maximum security unit requested transfers after only a short period, citing the mental exhaustion associated with working in such an intense atmosphere. For inmates, the maximum security environment was both physically restrictive and emotionally taxing. Limited movement, stricter routines, and decreased social interaction impacted mental health. Those sent to the unit after infractions in other parts of the prison often experienced the transition as a sudden plunge into isolation and hyper-control. Conversely, inmates who had long histories of high-security incarceration sometimes viewed Stony Mountain's new unit as relatively moderate compared to other facilities, though still rigid enough to reinforce the severity of their classification. The result was a population with mixed responses, some resistant and volatile, others resigned and withdrawn. The introduction of the maximum security wing also altered the institution's approach to rehabilitation and programming. Whereas the medium security sections offered more diverse educational, vocational, and cultural programs, the maximum security environment required stricter oversight and smaller group sizes. Many programs were shortened, adapted, or limited due to safety concerns. This created tension among inmates seeking opportunities for self-improvement, particularly those working toward parole eligibility. Staff faced the challenge of balancing risk management with the rehabilitative mandate of the Correctional Service of Canada. In some cases, innovative approaches were introduced, such as in-cell programming modules or enhanced one-on-one interventions, but these efforts often struggled against resource constraints and security limitations. Operationally, the maximum security expansion increased demands on staffing levels, emergency response readiness, and administrative oversight. Incidents had to be documented more thoroughly, movement logs were expanded, and staff were required to maintain higher vigilance. The presence of high-risk inmates increased the potential for violent incidents, though the modern design helped contain many situations that might have escalated in older parts of the prison. Nevertheless, staff recognized that the new unit did not eliminate danger. It simply shifted the nature of it. Instead of spontaneous, chaotic confrontations, there were now more calculated and deliberate acts of resistance, often linked to gang influence or strategic manipulation. Perhaps the most lasting impact of the maximum security wing was its effect on the institution's identity. Stony Mountain was no longer primarily associated with its historical status as one of Canada's oldest prisons. It became a hybrid institution, part heritage site, part modernized correctional complex. This dual identity created ongoing challenges as the operational needs of a maximum security environment had to coexist with aging infrastructure, long-standing cultures, and entrenched inmate dynamics in the older units. In recent decades, Stony Mountain Institution has undergone a significant shift in strategy, moving away from the purely punitive approach that once defined its operations and toward a model centered on rehabilitation, skill building, and long-term reintegration. This transformation is not sudden or simple, especially for a facility with nearly 150 years of complex history, but it reflects a growing recognition within Canada's correctional system. Rehabilitation is essential for reducing recidivism, supporting safer communities, and offering inmates genuine pathways to change. Stony Mountain Institution, once known primarily for riots, violence, and harsh living conditions, has gradually begun to reshape its identity through modern programs, upgraded infrastructure, and targeted cultural and educational initiatives. One of the most important parts of this evolution is the investment in education and vocational training. The institution has expanded its classrooms, computer labs, and skill development workshops to accommodate a wider range of programs. Academic pathways such as literacy programs, high school completion, and basic computer training are now widely available. These programs aim to give inmates practical tools that can translate into stable employment once they are released. In an economy where digital literacy and trade certifications can determine survival, education inside the walls can be the difference between successful reintegration and a return to the cycle of incarceration. Alongside academic learning, vocational training has become a cornerstone of Stony Mountain's modern improvement efforts. Inmates can learn carpentry, small engine repair, upholstery, welding, and other trades recognized by national industry standards. These programs serve two purposes. First, they fill the long days with purposeful activity, reducing idle time that often fuels conflict. Second, they offer inmates a sense of competence and achievement, something many have never experienced before entering the institution. In an environment where self-worth can be fragile, gaining a trade skill helps inmates see themselves differently, not as permanent offenders but as individuals capable of growth and contribution. Another substantial advancement has been the development of culturally informed programming, particularly for Indigenous inmates, who represent a significant portion of the institution's population. Stony Mountain has introduced healing lodges, sweat lodges, elder services, and programming rooted in Indigenous traditions, spirituality, and community practices. These additions are not superficial. They are built upon the idea that healing must address identity, belonging, and generational trauma. Elders visit regularly to guide ceremonies, offer counseling, and help inmates reconnect with cultural teachings that may have been lost through disrupted childhoods or the effects of systemic inequality. These programs have been acknowledged as one of the institution's most meaningful steps toward rehabilitation, particularly because they address root causes rather than just the symptoms of criminal behavior. Mental health and addiction services have also expanded in recent years. Historically, Stony Mountain faced criticism for limited resources in these areas, but modernization efforts have focused on increasing psychological support, trauma-informed therapy, and substance use treatment. Many inmates arrive with complex mental health challenges, unresolved trauma, or addiction histories. Without targeted support, these issues often worsen inside the facility, contributing to violence, hopelessness, and self-destructive behavior. Improved access to therapists, counselors, and structured group programs, such as anger management, cognitive behavioral therapy workshops, and addiction recovery groups, represents an attempt to interrupt that cycle and prepare inmates for healthier futures. Infrastructure upgrades have played a role as well. Over the years, Stony Mountain has strengthened surveillance systems, renovated living units, and redesigned communal spaces to reduce blind spots and violent flashpoints. The maximum security unit, though built in response to safety concerns, also incorporates areas dedicated to programming rather than relying solely on isolation. Newer buildings include classrooms, workshops, visitation areas, and cultural spaces that reflect the institution's evolving priorities. These structural changes help create an environment more conducive to safety and learning, even as high-risk individuals remain housed within the facility. One of the broader goals within the modernization movement is to improve reintegration planning. Inmates nearing release now receive more consistent support through parole planning, job readiness training, community referrals, and connections with transitional housing. Reentry is one of the most difficult phases for former inmates, many of whom must rebuild their lives from scratch. Without support, it becomes easy to fall back into familiar patterns or negative influences. Modern reintegration strategies aim to give individuals a realistic chance at success by ensuring they have the documents, skills, and networks needed to start over. Despite these positive changes, transformation at a facility like Stony Mountain is not without challenges. The institution continues to grapple with issues such as gang influence, overcrowding, staff shortages, and the inherited culture of an old, historically violent prison. Modernization is an ongoing process, not a completed project. Even so, each step, whether an educational program, a cultural ceremony, or a renovated unit, marks a shift in how correctional systems view inmates and their potential. The evolution of Stony Mountain Institution shows how a place once known primarily for unrest and hardship can move toward a more balanced vision of corrections, one that acknowledges both accountability and human possibility. Rehabilitation is not simply a program, it is a philosophy that reshapes the institution from the inside out, influencing how staff interact with inmates, how inmates see themselves, and how the community ultimately receives them after release. Through modernization, Stony Mountain continues to work toward reducing violence, fostering growth, and creating an atmosphere where change is not only possible but actively supported.